Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second installment of our new Cecil Coffee Talks, a Q&A session. We have many, the large percentage of you are first-time attendees, so thank you very much. For those of you who've joined us again from a couple of weeks ago, thank you as well. But just a reminder, we'll start with a new topic, and then we will repeat some of the topics from the last week's presentation. As I mentioned, this is a new format for us. So I ask your patience as we work through this. Again, our thinking here is we're going to offer one of these or host one of these once a month moving through 2022 to give you, all of our users, and even those considering using us, the ability to see and ask and really drive the content of this to help ensure that Cecil becomes a non-event for you. We want to make sure we're addressing any concerns, but also sharing anecdotally what we're hearing from other users. So we're hoping in many ways to have this help, really kind of be a user group for all of our CECLSolver users. As we've mentioned in the initial webinar, we want this and we want you to help drive the future content. And so not only today will we ask and encourage questions, but also for you to submit those as we move forward. So again, so that there's nothing left unsaid or unasked to help make sure we get you all to the finish line successfully with this transition into Cecil. A couple of other things. Again, it's a new format. So as I mentioned, typically in our webinars, you're usually in presentation mode, which means you can hear us, but we can't hear you. This time it will be more interactive, so you'll be able to chat with us and submit questions, and we'll touch on that here in just a second. My name's Sean O'Brien. I'm the president of QwickRate. I am pleased today to be joined, as always, by Steve Huntington and Melanie Capasso. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and we'll continue moving forward. Steve?
Thanks again, everybody, for joining us this morning. My name is Steve Huntington. I'm the Director of Analytics here at QwickRate and QwickAnalytics. I've been working with community banks and credit unions for the past 25 years or so, building financial models, working on advisory, capital planning, strategic planning, valuation. And I've been working with Sean for over a decade now to bring these types of analytical tools and make them much more accessible to typical community banks. And I am a Wake Forest graduate, so go Deeks.
Thanks, Steve. Melanie?
Hi, everyone. My name is Melanie. I've been with QwickAnalytics for a couple years now. Most recently, I started helping Sean and Steve with some of the worm calculations having to do with your CECLSolver. So I will be in charge of some data mapping and helping you out with any of the calculations when it comes to the worm. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Melanie. So again, why are we here today? As we've been, working towards and trying to assist all of you with Cecil, it just occurred to us as we were entertaining a lot of the same questions, and often many of you had the same concerns about, Cecil. We just thought that this would be a helpful way and just hopefully provide some comfort that you're not going to be on this on your own. We will be having these every month in 2022, where we can not only address questions that we're hearing from our users, but we can also share insights we're hearing, best practices, any further conversations with regulators and auditors, and just give you the opportunity to once a month just kind of check in and make sure you're progressing on the path you want and need to satisfy the transition for Cecil. So again, we'll take Q&A either throughout the presentation or at the end, but please submit those as they come. We'll try to address them. And then we'll also talk about, upcoming coffee talks as well. So just a reminder how you can participate. So you are currently muted when you entered the webinar, but if you raise your hand, you can actually ask a question out loud. Well, but if you prefer just to submit the questions, you can click on the Q&A box or the chat feature, which both are shown here at the bottom of this slide. And again, we'll be able to see those and then take those throughout the call. Again, I kind of recovered most of this. We just think this will be a good practice or a best practice and share other best practices. We want to share common questions we're receiving from our users. We felt like this was a an additional way we could effectively address them for everybody. We'll talk about changes we made to CECL. And we'll also just, again, we've continued to make improvements. And so, I just realized I opened up the wrong webinar here. So I'm gonna pause here for a second and stop sharing my screen. So I apologize for that. Bear with me one second while I pivot out of this.
So in case anybody was curious, we also have a version of our CECLSolver tool for credit unions as well. Credit unions are not exempt from CECL any more than you community bank, commercial banks are, and methodology is actually identical. They have different segmentation in their loan portfolio, but otherwise it's the same tool that can get you there.
So again, I apologize for having these.
But you're correct. You guys do pay income taxes, has been so eloquently pointed out. So fair enough.
Yeah. All right. Let me go ahead and get this going. That was. All right.
So the first thing Sean's going to share here is just a very brief overview of the tool. So just a couple of slides here just to remind you what for you new users, how the tool works. Because we're getting all that data directly from your call reports, we don't need all of we don't need you guys to do a big kind of ramp up process to get ready to use the tool. From the first time that you ever log in, you'll be able to, you'll see all of your historical financial data already preloaded into the system, your balances, your charge-offs, your recoveries, your past dues by segment going all the way back in time, further than we need to from a CECL perspective. So the first time you log in, it'll be there. The first task that we all have to manage, and Sean will get the screen up in just a second here, is the first thing we all have to manage is getting that warm calculation. So Melanie's going to walk you through how to do that. Sometimes it's as easy as requesting it from your core or ALM provider. Sometimes you have to calculate it internally, or sometimes you're going to ask us for some assistance in calculating it for you. But rest assured, as much help as you need in getting that warm calculation we can provide. Once we have the warm value, right, that weighted average remaining maturity, since CECL is all about losses over the remaining life of the assets, we need to get a feel for what the remaining life of your assets are. But once we plug that into the tool, it kind of, all the rest of the number crunching gets taken care of for us. Our tool goes back into time, pulls all of your loss and balance and recovery data for those custom look back periods by segment, and uses that to calculate the that's the same version again, Sean.
Whoop.
That's the credit union one again.
Oh God.
But it looks just like this too, so no worries. Once you plug in the warm, it calculates your historical lifetime loss rate by segment, right? That's the first big piece of the puzzle for CECL, is before we look outside your four walls into the environment around you, before we take into account how we're going to modify that historical experience, we need to gather the information to do that. So we calculate your historical lifetime loss rates by segment, and then we allow you to do all the modification that we need via qualitative factor adjustments. We've recently enhanced the Q factors section of our tool. It used to be a little bit more of a blunt object where we just asked you for your net Q factors, and how you would build up those Q factors was certainly up to you and certainly subjective by nature. But we had a lot of requests to give some more granularity and customization in our qualitative factor adjustments area of the tool. So we're going to go ahead. So we went ahead and added that to the tool. Sean, do you want me to? You want me to just share my?
Yeah, if you can share your screen, Steve, go ahead and share it. That'll be easier.
Give me one second.
Mixing and matching all these.
All right, I'm going to share my screen.
So you can see, again, I your patience on this. Now you understand why. I appreciate everybody's patience.
Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Excellent. So here is the bank version of the CECLSolver tool. As we were discussing, right here is where we plug in the weighted average remaining maturities. It uses that information to calculate your historical loss rate, giving you all the detail that you need, right? There's no hidden black box within our tool. All of the supporting detail that you need to audit these calculations is all sitting right here in our tool. Once we have that, we give you all the data you would need for external qualitative factor adjustments, including giving you access to peer data. You can build custom peer groups and calculate segment level lifetime loss rates for your entire peer group, which is critical in getting an idea of what's going on outside your four walls, right? In the environment around us. Because once we segment our portfolio, we find a lot of times that for any individual segment, you might have limited or actually no loss data at all during any recent look back period. Yet we still need to establish some sort of non-zero CECL reserve, despite having a segment where you have a small population of loans and really no loss experience. So we can get that, thicken that sample size by looking at similar community banks in your neck of the woods and seeing what losses they've had over a similar look back period in that specific segment of a loan portfolio.
Steve?
This is, yes.
Yeah, just to interject, I apologize. We actually
Sure.
had a question come in.
Okay.
Asked, we have limited loss history. Is there a best practice to adjust our history across the look back period to peer?
Yes, and this is exactly how we do it. So we look, and this is an example. This is a pretty large community bank up in Maine. They have a few $1 billion in loans, so they're on the large size for sure. But even for this community bank, they have $500 million in C&I loans, and over the last 4 or 5 years, they have absolutely zero goose egg in losses. So not only does that not give us the information we need to justify having a CECL reserve, also, if we try to correlate that with an economic trend to project it that way, we also come up with nothing, right? Because how are we supposed to correlate 6 years worth of zeros with some economic trend that smoothly has gone up and down over time? We can't. So we thicken the sample size. We build an intelligent peer group. We look at what their losses have looked like over a similar look back period. And that gives us some guidance. It won't tell you what your losses are going to be, but it'll give you an idea. If you had a much larger sample size of loans from across your market, what that loss rate might have looked like over a recent look back period. And so when I click on the Q factors tab, we can click through the portfolio here and kind of get a summary of everything going on in one visualization. So if I'm looking at 1 to 4 family revolving loans, I can see what my bank's long-term loss trend is, what my peer group's long-term loss trend is, what kind of look back period we're using, and what our total CECL estimate is based upon the inputs we plugged in. And so if I were to come in here and I'd say, I've looked at unemployment rates, I've looked at my peer trends, I want to make a slight, qualitative factor adjustment based upon the peer experience. I want to make another slight qualitative factor adjustment based upon economic data. You notice as I'm doing that, this chart is updating in real time. The CECL estimate's getting a little bit higher and higher. And let's say I've looked at my risk, I've done some, internal qualitative factor adjustments. I've looked at how my risk grades have changed, and maybe they're improving. So I want to have a negative 40 basis point qualitative factor adjustment, an internal one. I do that, and this updates again on the fly. So it allows you to have more control over your qualitative factors, internal and external. We don't have the data for your internal qualitative factor adjustments, right? That's the same process you guys have always been doing in your current reserve methodologies. Looking at internal non-public information, like your risk grades and how they're migrating, to get a feel, at least directionally, for how you think losses might be headed in any given part of the portfolio. But now we can give you much better, justifiable, defensible data for the external side of it, right? The environmental side of it in not only in that charge-offs for your peer group, but if you want, you can actually go upstream now and take a look at your non-accruals trend over time and compare it with your peer groups and compare it with your CECL estimate, or even go all the way up to, this is the first time that, I guess if you want to say it, emerging credit trends, right? Where we want to not, before it gets to a charge-off, it goes through the non-accrual process, and before it gets there, they're 30 to 89 days past due. So this is kind of the most upstream we can go with public data to give you an idea directionally where problem credits and then ultimately charge-offs may be headed in the future. So this is a recent enhancement to be able to do that. And of course, we allow you to have some to take a look at some economic trends down here from Federal Reserve and overlay them over those loss trends over time. So gives you a much better kind of grounded, defensible approach towards your qualitative factor adjustments. We're going to talk a little bit more about Q factors in a few minutes. I probably already said too much about it, but this does at least give you guys a quick overview of how the tool works. You can save scenarios. You can have as many scenarios saved as you want to. You can export the tool into a PDF environment, into an Excel environment with as much or as little detail as you want. And so we really do help manage the process and kind of take some of the confusion away from CECL. And it's ready to be shared with auditors, examiners. We've had auditors and examiners, many of them look at it, provide feedback. We worked with the examiners while developing the tool in the first place. And so we think it's a good, give you a good handle on CECL. Sean?
Great, thanks, Steve. I'm going to
Sure.
take back the screen here, hopefully now. And again, I appreciate everybody's patience. So let me get to here. We'll get the slideshow up again.
That's still the credit union one, but I don't
No.
think it makes much
Yeah,
difference.
no, I think we're okay. So,
Yeah.
all right, so we're going to stop the subtitles here. And so, I think one of the things that we're adding this time is just, the timeline that everybody's kind of thinking about with transitional, excuse me, with CECL. When do you need to have your solution in place? When's your next exam? And if you're adopting early, do you have a reason to? So Steve, do you want to take these and walk people through the things you're hearing from
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I hate answering questions with questions, but sometimes it's just it's necessary to get some more information from banks. Typically, we get asked all the time, when do we need to have a solution? We know when the absolute deadline is, right? We have to be living in a CECL world starting at the beginning of 2023. But obviously, that does not mean that you can simply decide on a solution and get up and going within a day or two. And that last exam that you have before 2023, sometime during the year next year, your examiners are very likely to expect you to be pretty much ready to go. So when people say, we like your tool, we don't want to start paying for it until we have to, when should we turn this on? When should we start a subscription? And I typically say, well, when was your last exam? When is your next exam? And is there any reason why you'd want to actually adopt CECL early? We don't see very much of that happening. Of the 5,000 or so commercial banks in the United States, probably I can count on my hands the number of community banks that have elected to adopt CECL early. It's typically a very specialized situation that would make that make sense. If you've been having some sort of conflict or discussion, we'll say, with your examiners, and they're not happy with the way you're doing your reserve or where your reserve is coming out, instead of fighting the good fight with the old methodology, it could be a good time, if you were to run your CECL reserve your reserve under a CECL methodology, and find that it actually gives you a more defensible answer for maybe a slightly lower reserve than what the old methodologies have been giving us. That could be an opportunity to refresh the whole conversation or restart the conversation with your examiners by deciding to adopt CECL early. We have a handful of banks that we're working with who are considering doing that. Instead of fighting the old fight, they decided they're going to go ahead and just start fighting a new fight now. But typically, I would say 99% of the industry is going to be adopting, not early adopting. And so if you have an exam in the first or second quarter of next year, you want to make sure that you have a solution in place at least a couple months beforehand, because what the examiners are going to see when they come in, not only do you have a solution in place, do you understand how it works from a methodology standpoint? They'll say, what are the sensitivities of your model or your solution? What inputs are really going to move the needle and which ones are pretty much irrelevant? And then what is your surplus or shortfall showing as of right now? And have you been tracking it over time? So at least having a couple runs, right, where you've built a scenario or two as of a couple months before they come in, it'll just display to them that you've been following the timeline, you're tracking it, you're running it in parallel, and that should hopefully get them off our back until the following year, which is the first time you'll be sharing them your CECL with it being your actual reserve methodology of choice, so to speak.
Great. question come in that I thought we could take at this point too, because it kind of relates to something you were just covering. So the question is, I've been looking at hundreds of, thousands of Fred data points, and what recommendations do you have? Because most of us can't spend the time to go through that much data to determine what is the best fit for us. And this is regarding, trying to model a little bit of an economic forecast, Steve.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of good information on that because it's gonna be very specific to your bank. What types of loans do you guys have more concentration in? Are you more of an ag bank? Are you more in a rural area or a much more metropolitan urban type area? The size of your bank, the types of losses you've had in the past versus where you reserve it. So there's a lot of very specific questions about your situation that would help give us some guidance on, hey, this is the type of economic data that could be really helpful or is totally irrelevant to your specific situation. We have always leaned more on the side of looking at, because we have really good peer data now, apples to apples, comparable segment level peer data, which I think honestly can be a lot more helpful and justifiable than some of the economic trends. That's what we find all the time is, someone in the past, their examiners have wanted them to use these 3 economic trends to try to help forecast losses into the future. But in order to do that effectively, not only do you have to find some sort of correlation between your loss experience and that economic trend, which is sometimes very hard to do if you have minimal losses, like very many of us do. But even if you can establish a historical correlation, you have to accurately project that economic trend out into the future. I feel like if we were really good at doing that, none of us would be on this call right now, honestly. And even if you were to do that, you have to assume the correlation will continue, right? We saw a high correlation between mortgage losses and unemployment during the last recession, right? 2009, 10, 11, mortgage losses did this at the same time that unemployment was doing this. Well, guess what happened last year during COVID, right? We had our next recession. Unemployment did this again, and mortgage losses did absolutely nothing. The correlation from the last recession was absolutely nullified 100%. And so if you had been using that correlation as a basis for your loss expectation, your reserve would have blown up last year. I mean, doubled at least. And yet we didn't see that happening. So again, I think looking at the peer data and a little bit more than some of these economic trends is probably going to be the way to go. However, we all live in the same world, same real world. And if your examiner wants you using these economic trends, we still need to do it to an extent. But I don't have any really good specific data on these are the exact economic trends that I suggest everybody should be looking at.
Yeah, and I would agree. Yeah, I agree. I think the thing that, we emphasize, and I know I'm a director in a small community bank in Illinois. And so, the focus we're taking is we're going to continue to do the current assessment that, we've done and all of you, I'm sure, are doing, and just having a nod to some of the things that might impact our portfolio in the future. And that's why we've included, the points around, unemployment. We'll be adding additional Fred data points. And so there is a tool within QwickAnalytics too, just to see all your historical credit information from the call report. And you can overlay like the unemployment rate on it and see if there's any correlations, as Steve said. But again, I think it's a little bit of a fool's errand just because you can go down a rabbit hole and never come up. So, I think we want to provide you with some, data, but I wouldn't overestimate the need for it because again, you're going to know best what's going to impact your portfolio rather than some, deep dive into an econometric model.
How often do we need to calculate the WARM and how often do we need to run the CECL tool? I think they're 2 different questions potentially. There is nowhere in the CECL standard is there any discussion of how often things like average remaining maturities need to be calculated or recalculated. It needs to be current. So it's going to be a bit of a trial and error process. It's an important question because, especially using our tool, it's the only, I wouldn't even call it heavy lifting, but it's the only kind of loan level data you need to dig through at all is to get that WARM calculation. So it takes a little bit longer than using the rest of the tool does. And we don't want you guys wasting time that could best be spent elsewhere. So if you're running your CECL tool on a monthly basis, I certainly wouldn't suggest you need to still recalculate your WARMs across the whole portfolio every month. Quarterly would be where I would suggest starting. But if you find that even quarterly, let's say we're recalculating the WARMs by segment every single quarter, and we're finding that they're changing by 1 or 2 or 3 basis points, right? 3.05 years, and the next quarter it's 3.07 years. That's not going to move the needle. That's going to be completely irrelevant for the model calculations, in fact. So that'll tell us that we're probably doing it too often. Now, if we're only doing it a couple times a year and our WARM is changing, the average remaining maturity is changing from 6 years to 4 years, that's a huge difference. And so that probably gives us a hint that we need to be doing it maybe a little bit more frequently. But it's also going to be what your examiner is comfortable with at any given point in time. Although, obviously so much of this is going to be reliant on that. How often do we need to run the CECL tool in general? Right now, before we're living in a CECL world where we're all just trying to show our examiners and prove to them that, we are ready and that we are tracking it, I think quarterly. That's when we get the most new data, right? Every quarter we get a whole new set of loss data, not just for your bank, but for the entire industry, for your peer group. And so that's when it's really gonna maybe see some slight differences. CECL in general is all about life of the loan versus any one annualized period of time. So if you think about it on an incremental basis, our reserve should actually be more consistent and changing month to month or quarter to quarter a little bit less under CECL, because we're taking into account 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years worth of data in calculating it. And so it should provide a more stable reserve over time, meaning that you might need to run it a little bit less frequently because it's not going to change quite as fast. Sean, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, again, I think, most of us are in the process of running our ALLL quarterly. I think that's sufficient. As Steve said, I just did a review of a bank's WARMs calculations, and, from the previous quarter, we had, as Steve mentioned, right, we went from WARMs of, 3.67 to 3.72. So they just oftentimes are not going to change dramatically quarter to quarter. So again, I think you can take a look at them, but if you find that they're not changing a whole lot, that's probably not going to be surprising. But then I think, certainly looking at this on a quarterly basis, if you want to do that through the transition year, but then obviously just similar to what you're doing with the ALLL today, quarterly is going to be sufficient.
Yeah. And as soon as when we get feedback from the examiners, obviously then we'll adjust as necessary. If that's not something they're overly worried about, maybe we can back off a bit and save ourselves a little bit of time and trouble. If that's something they're honing in on and focusing on significantly, then maybe they're going to want to see that it's been done in the last, couple months. So we'll have to play off of that for sure. Finally, creating multiple scenarios as of the same date. It's a best practice that I highly suggest, because right now we're in a very unique position where we're not beholden to our CECL reserve, right? It is not our actual reserve. It is just right now a hypothetical number that we're comparing to our reserve to get a feel for where it's going to all fall out at the end of next year. So we have an opportunity to create a couple different scenarios, create a more optimistic and then a more pessimistic Q factor scenario. So you go into this first exam with a range of reserves that could all be appropriate, appropriately using an approved methodology for CECL. And even if it's a range you can drive a truck through, so that you can share that with your examiners and maybe get some feedback, right? We're always playing that cat and mouse game where the examiner is going to walk into your office with some preconceived notion of where they expect you to land at the end of this, but they're not going to tell you what that is. And so if you can say, hey, listen, I can justify $1 million or 2 million and anywhere in that range, and here's how I would do it. And by showing them a couple different scenarios, then maybe you're more likely to get some feedback from them saying, hey, we expect you to kind of land right around where you guys are now. That helps inform all of your future scenarios that you build. So it's just another best practice that we suggest. You probably shouldn't, build scenarios that create a range that you can drive a truck through a year and a half from now, because at that point you'll be expected to really have a much better exact picture of where you're going to end up. But right now is a unique opportunity to do that with very little risk involved.
Okay, so we're going to talk about calculating the WARMs. I know a question just came in about the WARMs, and so we will get to that. But we're going to have Melanie just kind of jump in here and talk a little bit about getting good information so that she can help us if you want us to calculate the WARMs, but just what's entailed in calculating a WARM in different ways that you might be able to accomplish that. Melanie?
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, so like you mentioned, I'm responsible for generating the spreadsheets that calculate your WARM to plug into your CECL tool. I can typically handle these requests very quickly. What I need from you is a clean and complete data file. So I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes just going over exactly what that looks like. So right off the bat, just a few things about the files themselves. We do ask them that you submit them in CSV or Excel format. If it's in any other type of format, please go ahead and convert it for us and just make sure that all the data is there. I've noticed a lot of times when people are converting data, things like the column headers get cut off or some of the data gets cut off. So we just want to be able to make sure that all the data is there and identify what data we are looking at. Number two, please provide an as-of date. This is just the date of the financials, the date the report was ran. You can put that anywhere in the report, or you can attach your email, however you want it. And last but not least, please make sure that all the files only include active loans. This includes participation loans. That being said, please exclude any loans that have been paid off or been charged off. That's just a few things for the file. Next, we're going to go into the 4 necessary fields that are required within each loan record. This is true for all loans, except for credit card loan, all loan types, except for credit card loans or any loans that don't have a maturity date. Those are processed a little bit differently, and we'll go over what we need for that next. But for the majority of the loans, we need 4 things. The first we need is a unique loan number. This is just an internal reference for me and you. So that being said, please do not use any private customer information such as account numbers or credit card numbers. Next, we need the current loan balance. We would need the maturity date, and if you cannot provide us with the maturity date, we can calculate it so long as we have all the necessary information, when the date for the loan, the date the loan was opened, and the term, etc. And then last, we do ask for the call report account code. What this means is I have to be able to map each of your loans according to where they are in your call report. So we just ask that you give us a way to identify this. This can be either directly on the report, or you can have a lot of things have given me just a key that ties to each loan, and that way I can allocate each loan to their appropriate call report category. So that's just the 4 fields. Next, we're going to go, and this is just kind of what a clean, sorry, go ahead, Sean, you can go to the next slide. This is just an example of a clean data file. It's very, very simplified. You might have more columns and everything. That's okay, just as long as those 4 fields are there. As you can see, we have a report date, and then we also have a loan code that ties with their call report category. So next, we're just going to go, and then here's another example of a nice clean file with the code. And last, we're going to go over credit card loans or any loans that do not have a stated maturity date. Like I said, these are processed a little bit different. So we do need the total loan balance as well as the last monthly principal payment. If you do not have the principal payment information, as long as you provide us with the interest rate, we will be able to calculate it for you. And just so you guys know, we do take the credit card loans on an aggregate level. So if you just have the total final balance, the total monthly payment amount, that works for us as well. So next, we have just another quick example of what a nice, clean credit card file looks like. As I mentioned, if you have any questions regarding your data, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I do keep your call reports open when I process these, so that if I see there's a big discrepancy in your balances, I will make sure to reach out to you before getting the WARM back to you. That's all I have on my end. Go ahead, Sean.
Great, thanks, Melanie. So we had a couple of questions come in. First off, for those without a maturity date, is that the information that is needed to calculate the outstanding principal balance now, and then the ACL is based on that?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. For those loans without a maturity date, is the information that is needed used to calculate the outstanding principal balance now, and then the ACL is based on that?
So let me just rephrase, I think, a bit. If we don't have maturity date information, then we have to estimate. We still have to estimate the life of the loan. And so what we do is we estimate the life instead of a maturity date. We substitute. Our proxy is date when the balance will get to zero, right? If someone continues making similar payments as they've made in the past, at some point the balance will reach zero. That is our proxy for maturity date for those loans that don't have maturity dates, like credit cards. If somebody's making, paying up $500 a month on their $10,000 credit card balance, we figure out what amount of that is principal, and then however many months for that to get to zero is the remaining life of that loan. We of course we have to make some global assumptions always. For revolving lines of credit, they would never end or mature or get to zero if you're continuing to allow more credit usage. So the first assumption we always have to make is that we go on the current balance. We don't assume additional credit usage, because those aren't loans that exist today. It's just we look at the balance that exists today and then bring that down to zero. Can you unshare your screen for 1 second, Melanie, so I can share mine, so I can.
Oops.
All right, it's all right.
Let's see. I think I need to stop, Steve. Hold on.
No, she should just be able to click end share. There we go. All right, now I'll share mine.
Yeah, and so just a couple of the questions, Steve, so you have a little context. Yeah. Again, we had a couple of questions come in regarding the prepayments and things. So the first one was, could you walk us through how you adjust the WARM for scheduled amortization and estimated prepayments?
Yeah, so that's an input into the WARM estimator. This is an Excel file that we provide for you guys that you can use as much or as little as you see fit. If we were doing your WARM calculations for you, then we would be using this format and then sending you this spreadsheet that you could use for the inputs into your tool. If you want to do your own WARM calculations, then you could use a spreadsheet like this as well. So here's what Melanie was discussing. Balance and maturity date are the only two pieces of information that we need. The rest is math, and that's to get an unadjusted WARM. Obviously, we do want to make an adjustment for prepayments. So right here is where you'd plug in some sort of an annual prepayment rate estimate. That's not part of the calculations in the tool. That's an assumption that you would have to make going into it. Prepayments can be obviously all over the map depending upon your feelings about the interest rate environment and everything else. So we have the number that's in there by default is a plug, and we ask you to update that. Sean, any more thoughts on that?
Follow up to that. Yeah, just to follow up to that. Right. And again, I think this gets into one of the, like, our overriding sentiments with CECL is to try to be, directionally correct and not overly precise. Right. Because in an interest rate environment that we've just come through, where rates were falling, obviously we've seen a lot more prepayments. If we start to flatten and see rising interest rates, then prepayment assumptions are going to go up. So again, we have to make the best educated guess we have. And I think it gets back to what Steve says, playing around with different scenarios to see just in fact what makes sense for your portfolio. Steve, the second question is what if our WARM is greater than 13 years?
So yeah, it's a good question. Right now, as of right now, the tool our tool sets a limit on WARMs of 13 years. And the reason we've done that historically is because the majority of the time, if your WARM is over 13 years, there's some issue with the calculation. Not always. There's always exceptions to the rule, but after we take into account prepayments, we almost never see a WARM, much above 8 to 10 years, honestly. Even in a portfolio, let's say you have a portfolio of nothing but 30-year mortgages. At any given point in time, you should, even without prepayments, you'd be in maybe around 15-year, 16-year WARM maximum if you have nothing but 30-year mortgages in a segment. After we take into account prepayments, that number usually drops by at least half. Just kind of intuitively, when we think about it, the average life of a 30-year mortgage, at least in the recent history, hasn't been much more than 7 or 8 years. And that's all because of obviously, lots of people prepaying, refinancings and selling of houses. But if you're in a situation where you're sure you've done all the math correctly, you have very low prepayment rate estimate for some reason that's justifiable, and you're finding a WARM that's more than 13 years, then, just get a hold of us and we can discuss it on a one-off basis to make sure that everything makes sense and how we should manage it from that perspective. But the tool is flex enough to manage that through the qualitative factor process, if no other area. John.
And then just one other thing, question came in, if there's any changes to the spreadsheet, will you send out updated versions? Yes. So within our CECLSolver, anytime we make any adjustments to anything in QwickAnalytics, we always, if there's a link that needs to be refreshed, we will do that. But yeah, you'll always see the most current version of the spreadsheet or anything else that we have out there.
Yep.
Okay, so let me take back the screen here in a second, Steve. To the right place where we need to move next. So the next thing is, is Q factors, right? So again, this is something we've, continually covered and continue to get questions about. But we're just going to talk a little bit about Q factors. Steve, I think you addressed a little bit of this already.
Yeah, we've discussed, I guess, most of the questions around Q factors and some of the new enhancements to our tool that give you some more customization and granularity around Q factors. I already sort of dug into that a little bit at the beginning of the call, where in the new version of our tool, you have more flexibility in plugging in external environmental Q factors, and then you have total customization available. You can add as many internal qualitative factors as you want. You can label them how you want, depending upon how you look at it. And that this is the one part of CECL that I think is as close to what we've always been doing as anything else, right? We've always been looking at that internal non-public information to try to estimate whether we think losses are going to be higher or lower than they've been for the last couple of years. And so really that part of your current reserve analysis and kind of continues pretty unabated in under CECL. We just wanted it to provide a little bit a space where you could plug that stuff into the tool as opposed to try to do the math yourself. And so now we have a little bit more customization there. The other one, accommodating individually assessed loans. Good segue into that. That's the other area that we've been waiting for really good guidance on the individually assessed loans issue for a while now. And despite the fact that we haven't really gotten as good guidance as we would have liked to have gotten at this point, I'm sure we'll get much more detailed guidance on it as we go through 2022. But we didn't really want to wait any longer before we provided a mechanism in our tool to manage that, so you don't have to manage it separately from our tool. And we know that the question we get, which I'll probably get on this call if we haven't already, Sean, is when do I have to stick a loan in the individually assessed? Like what is the threshold for that? It's a good question without a very clear answer. We know that it's not the old threshold, right? The whole concept was that the old FAS 5, FAS 114 impairment notion ceases to exist and is completely replaced with the CECL standard. But that does not necessarily mean that there's never a situation where you have to manage an individual loan by itself, right? Where you have to cull it from the herd, so to speak, and provide a specific individual reserve because it's close to being defaulted on. You have a pretty good notion of what that loss might be. So now in the tool, we allow you a space to put in the information for those individually assessed loans and tell us where in the call report it's coming from. Again, since our tool by default is based upon, it focuses on the segmentation available for the call reports, we need to be able to strip that loan out of the pool, right? Out of the collectively assessed one. So we ask you where it's coming from on the call report. And then you just plug in the balance and how much you expect to collect. And it flows through to the summary part of a tool. So you don't need a separate tool to manage the individual assessments with our recent enhancement to the tool. That's all I kind of wanted to share on that note, Sean.
Yeah. So just another question came in, Steve. WARM calculated on all active loans. Should the individually assessed loans be removed before calculating WARM?
That's a good question. My first thought is it really doesn't matter. If you've got hundreds of loans in a segment, whether you remove 2 loans or not, unless that loan has an absolutely gigantically outsized balance, which is unlikely, it'll be a rounding error. But that's not the question. The question is, should I do it for a best practice standpoint? I would honestly say no. because what we're trying to get a feel for is, for this entire segment of the portfolio, what's the average remaining life? And we're going to use that to project forward. We're going to have more losses in the future. It's not just about, the loans on the books historically. If that loan that's now individually assessed, if it was historically a part of that pool, right? Then going forward, we might still expect to see, we still have to manage it going forward. So again, from a practical standpoint, I really don't think it makes a hill of beans a difference, honestly, but I probably wouldn't go through the trouble of excluding them. Even methodologically, I believe it makes as much, if not more, sense to keep them in there.
Yeah, it's just a small number, so.
Yeah.
Okay, just a reminder, if there's any more questions, here's how you can participate. You can, again, Q&A box or chat. So I appreciate everybody submitting those again to us today. I apologize for some of my own technical difficulties and fogginess this morning. So I appreciate everybody's patience. Let me see. So again, at this point, if there's anything else on your mind, any questions or comments or anything else that we'd like to cover today, we will take those now and just give it another second or two. And if we don't, then we'll let you get to the rest.
Again, there's no stupid questions here. Send us the question via the chat or the Q&A, and whatever it is, we're happy to discuss it. A lot of people may have the same question, honestly, and just afraid to ask. So don't be shy.
So Steve, we just got a question. Would you like
Sure.
your thoughts or our thoughts on the scale tool that the Fed released? So let me just take that one first, then I'll let you go, Steve. So
sure.
Things. One, the Fed introduced a tool. Obviously it's something out there that can certainly be utilized. It's a little bit counterintuitive. We do have on our and maybe Steve, you can pull that up while I'm talking. We do have the presentation that the Fed gave. We also have a PowerPoint deck. We are actually also even, working on incorporating that as a secondary tool. We just think for most community banks, you're going to have to do, some work to be able to get some of the numbers. And just for a lot of the reasons, we just think, it probably isn't going to work for a lot of them. It's certainly, it's certainly like any other option, and there's no one specific option for CECL that's perfect. But I think their main objective was simply to provide a very simplistic tool, which they did, but it may not be simplistic in your application of it because there's still work that you're going to have to do to utilize it. Steve, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. And so I think we sort of made a decision that we were going to rebuild the scale tool in our interactive environment and kind of offer it as a, if nothing else, kind of a sanity check to the warm method, so you can have some more ammunition, so to speak, when you're sharing with your examiners. But it's not, the scale tool is not they said, Fed came right in and said, listen, this is not a safe harbor. This is not something that we promise will work for you. This isn't even coming from the FDIC, it's coming from the Fed. But I think in my opinion, what it does is it gives even more validation that you don't need an overly complex solution to CECL. Honestly, our tool, the warm method, seems complex, not complex, but more detailed than the scale tool is. So if we look at the scale tool, it has even less segmentation because the scale tool is based upon that disaggregated loan loss reserve data that the large banks are filling out on their call reports now. There's only 6 buckets. 6 total buckets for your entire portfolio in the scale tool. So if your examiners are concerned about the segmentation on the call reports, the 15 segments that we can get from call report data, they're going to be even more concerned with boiling everything down into 6 buckets. So we didn't really love that. And it's a little bit counterintuitive because it's kind of based upon you assuming that you're the same as the large banks that are filling out the disaggregated loan loss reserve data from a loss perspective. And so the starting point is assuming that your experience is identical to a $50 billion bank on the other side of the country, and then making some adjustments to tell you why you're not exactly the same as them. We think that's a little bit backwards in its methodology, but recognizing it is coming from a regulator, right? We didn't want to discount it completely. So we are kind of re-engineering the scale tool, and we're gonna offer it as a, in my opinion, just a double check so that you can have it and see what it would look like under scale. But for many reasons that I'm happy to discuss on a on a one-off call with anybody, I think our tool is a lot more intuitive and makes a lot more just common sense, where the scale misses the mark a little bit. But again, it certainly makes us more comfortable that a relatively straightforward call report based approach to CECL can be sufficient and more than sufficient from a CECL perspective. Sean?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And another question came in, kind of related, are we seeing other methods being used by community banks? And of course, the answer is yes. I think, again, a lot of the initial tools pushed people towards very loan level probability to default types of exercises. And again, this is where we get into, you can do a lot of work. And right now, I would suggest to probably most of you on the call, your current ALLL is probably supported or defended by Q factors. That's probably going to be true for you for the near future with CECL. So the question becomes, how much work do you want to do to end up having to just do Q factors, right? And so that's why we think portfolio level solutions such as ours, utilizing the WARM, gives you a familiar way to do it, to handle CECL that's, familiar to what you're doing in the ALLL. It's a process you're comfortable with. And so that's why we're seeing it be the widely adopted methodology for most community banks. Question came in, how do you handle WARMs that are say 30-year amortizations due in 5 that end up being renewed on the same terms at maturity 1 to 2 times? Do you always use the stated maturity of a loan in the WARM calculation?
Yes, we always use the stated contractual maturity date. Right in the CECL standard, they are very specific about saying that there should be no assumptions about renewals made ever. It's just the loan that's on the books right now. So we never assume that. We simply look at the balance and the stated maturity date, and that is it.
Great. The question came in, will the slides from the presentation be provided? Yes, they will. Again, we'll get you the proper deck. And then finally, the question came in, how are most people estimating their prepayment speeds? Steve, you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, it's sort of it's a little bit all over the map, and I know that's a good and a bad thing, is because we reached the end of the internet multiple times in trying to find really good industry data on prepayments, prepayment speeds. And while there is some information about mortgage loans specifically because of the mortgage-backed securities market, obviously there's lots of studies done on refinancings and prepayments from mortgages. For all the rest of the segments of the portfolio, there's really very little of that data out there. We wanted to give you guys some good guidance so that if you didn't have a lot of data on hand to do very specific prepayment studies and couldn't get any help from your core processor on doing any prepayment studies, that you'd have some intelligent estimate of the prepayments. And unfortunately, from an industry standpoint, we haven't seen much of that yet. We're currently have multiple calls in lots of places on the regulatory side to try to get some more defensible information about prepayments, but they always like to punt it right back to us and say, well, we can't really give you any good standards. It's different depending upon everyone's individual situations, right? Everyone's bank is an individual snowflake, and it has to be done based upon their historical experience, which of course doesn't really help us at all. But as we get more information about that, or find some better best practices, we'll certainly share them. And if anybody on the call here has access or has seen some of that data in a way that they've discussed with their examiners, we would be all ears to hear about it as well. Great,
thanks, Steve. Final question is there any way to eliminate the Q factors entirely? I would say the short answer is no. It's just part of the process. I think you can downplay, or I shouldn't say downplay. I think you can minimize the impact of the forecasting piece. I think you want to pay some adherence to it, but like Steve said, right, utilizing our tool to incorporate the pure data, looking back at your historicals, are really going to give you the best sense, where your losses need to be and where the reserve needs to be in the future. So,
but even not making an adjustment is still like saying a 0%, a zero Q factor is not a lack of a Q factor. You're still actively saying, I've taken everything into account and I think my future losses will be just like my recent previous losses. So unfortunately, you can't get around it because, like I said, making a 0% adjustment is still actively saying you believe it'll be the same. So you can't get around the question, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. That's a good clarification.
Sure.
So again, just a reminder, we will be doing this again on January 21st. Hopefully at that point with a new year, I'll have fresh eyes and be able to read things better, and we'll take more questions. Certainly in the interim, if you have any additional questions or just like to see a demo with your data, email us at info@quickrate.com and we'll schedule a time to walk you through your data. But otherwise, thank you all very much for your patience. Thanks for attending today. Have a great weekend, and we hope we can help you soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.